The first time Xavier looked at me across that crowded room, I forgot, just for a moment, that I was a man nobody had chosen to stay for. He walked through that gala like he owned the air in it, and then he stopped. For me. Just me. We talked for 2 hours, and he listened like every word I said actually mattered, like I was someone worth hearing. Nobody had ever made me feel that before, not once in my whole life. I didn't know then that while I was finally learning what it felt like to be loved, my brother was already in the next room, trying to take that too. My name is Frederick, and I used to think loyalty looked like Julian. I know. Even now, writing that sentence, I feel the particular sting of a man who has only just understood the joke and discovered too late that he was always the punchline. But I want you to understand the full shape of what I believed before I tell you how it was taken apart. I want you to feel the warmth of the illusion before I describe the cold of its ruin, because that is the only honest way to tell this story. And if there is one thing left in me that Julian never managed to steal, it is my insistence on honesty. I was 7 years old when my mother, Elise Ashworth Delacroix, brought home a stepbrother. She had married Aldrich Voss, a man of quiet ambitions and quieter affections, and with him came Julian, who was 9. 2 years older, 2 years wiser, or so I thought for the better part of 2 decades. Julian had dark eyes that caught light the way still water does, holding it, hoarding it, giving back only a reflection, never the thing itself. But I was 7, and I did not know anything about the geometry of deception. I only knew that he taught me how to tie a proper Windsor knot on my 3rd day of attempting it. I only knew that he stood between me and a group of older boys at school who thought my embroidered handkerchief was an invitation for cruelty. I only knew that when my mother died, when she left me at 13 with nothing but her name on a trust document and a particular lavender-scented memory I have been chasing in every garden since, it was Julian who sat outside my bedroom door all night and said nothing, because he understood, somehow, that there are griefs language cannot enter. That is the Julian I loved. That is the Julian I built myself around, the way cities are sometimes built around rivers, not because the river is safe, but because it was there first. My mother left me everything. I did not know the full weight of that word, everything, until I was older and the family solicitors began using numbers with too many zeros and too much gravity. The Ashworth Delacroix estate, the commercial properties in 3 cities, the portfolio my grandfather had assembled with the patience of a monk, and the controlling shares in a textile company my grandmother had founded with her own stubborn hands. It was all mine, held in trust until my 25th birthday, administered in the interim by my father, Aldrich. Which meant, in the practical language of the world, that my father held the keys to the kingdom my mother had built for me, and Julian stood beside my father at every door. I want to be precise about something. My father was not a cruel man. He was a distant one. There is a difference, though the wound can feel the same. Aldrich Voss loved order, punctuality, reputation, and the comfortable numbness of routine. He did not know what to do with a son who wept openly, who filled journals with pressed flowers and half-formed poems, who fell in love easily and completely and without any of the self-protective caution the world rewards. I was, to my father, something of an embarrassment, not a source of malice, but a persistent inconvenience. And Julian, who had his father's angular jaw and his father's taste for discipline, was the son Aldrich understood, the son he could read, the son he chose, again and again in every small daily choosing that a father makes without realizing he is making them. I told myself this was fine. I had Julian, didn't I? I had a brother who understood me. The first boyfriend was Crispin. He was a painter, genuinely talented, with ink-stained fingers and the habit of tilting his head when he listened, as if the world were a canvas he was constantly reframing. I was 20 and helplessly enchanted. It was about hunger. Not the body's hunger, but the soul's. And he looked at me for a very long time and said, "Yes, exactly, yes." I floated home. I was ridiculous with happiness. 3 weeks later, Julian sat me down. "I'm worried about him, Frederick." That was always how it began. Not an accusation, a worry. Julian was always so worried. He had the face for it, too, that particular furrow between his brows, the measured pause before he spoke, the way he held his teacup with both hands as if bracing himself for something difficult. I've been asking around. Some people at the gallery said he has a habit of attaching himself to wealthy men. I don't want to see you used. You know how people are. You know how they see you. And there it was. You know how they see you. That sentence did more work than any other in Julian's arsenal. Because the truth was, I did not know how people saw me. I was never sure. I had grown up with a father who could not look at me directly, and a world that had taken my mother before I could ask her the essential questions. So I had this persistent, gnawing uncertainty about my own worth that Julian had identified very early and learned to play like a skilled musician plays an instrument, with total command, with almost artistic precision. I broke up with Crispin. I told myself it was the sensible thing, that I was protecting myself, that Julian, who loved me, would not say these things unless they were true. Crispin began dating Julian 6 weeks later. I remember the specific texture of that moment, standing in the hallway of my father's house, seeing them together at the bottom of the staircase, Julian's hand at the small of Crispin's back with a proprietorial ease that made my stomach turn cold. Julian looked up at me. His expression did not change. And that absolute steadiness, that absence of guilt or hesitation, was the thing I should have understood right then, should have read as the map it was. But I stood there, and I thought, perhaps it is a coincidence. Perhaps they simply found each other. Perhaps Crispin had feelings for Julian all along. Because the alternative, that the person I loved most had used my deepest insecurity as a weapon, was a thought too catastrophic to survive. So I did not think it. There were others after Crispin. There is a particular kind of sadness in cataloging them, each one a small life I could have had, a warmth I was quietly robbed of before I had time to fully settle into it. Matthias, who was a violinist, with a laugh that sounded like the first warm day of spring arriving unexpectedly. Jonas, who worked in restoration, old paintings, old furniture, old things brought back to life, and who had the most extraordinary patience, the kind that felt like a gift, like something hard-won. Ilan, who was studying architecture, who used to sketch buildings on napkins while we talked, who once told me that good architecture was really just the science of making people feel held. Julian worried about every single one of them. Julian always worried. And I, trained from years of repetition, trained in the particular school of his concern, broke up with every single one. I never connected the pattern to him. That is the thing I cannot fully explain to people who have not lived inside a long manipulation. You do not see it whole from the outside, with clean lines and clear causality. You see it from the inside, in small pieces, each piece surrounded by so much love and history and genuine need that you cannot step back far enough to see the shape of what is being done to you. Julian was woven into everything. He was my childhood, my grief, my only real warmth in a cold house. To suspect Julian was to suspect the foundations of my own life. It was structurally impossible, the same way you cannot question the ground beneath your feet while you are still standing on it. What I noticed instead was a growing hollowness, a specific loneliness that I could not name, because I did not understand its source. I began to think, in the bleak private language of my own interior, that perhaps I was simply unlovable. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical despair of someone performing their pain, but quietly, practically, the way a man comes to accept a limp after walking on a bad knee for too long. Perhaps this is simply what my life is, I thought. Perhaps there is something about me that makes love temporary. Perhaps I am too much, too soft, too legible, too easily read and too easily put down. My father had begun to believe something worse. I discovered this gradually in the architecture of his silences. He began to look at me with a new quality of distance, not just the old, comfortable indifference, but something sharper underneath it. Skepticism, a wariness that did not used to be there. He began excluding me from family meetings about the estate. He began CCing Julian on correspondence from the solicitors that should have come only to me. He stopped asking about my life with even the performative interest that had once at least gestured toward fatherhood. It was Julian's doing. I know that now with the calm certainty of a man holding documented proof. But then, I felt only the baffled hurt of a child who cannot understand what he has done wrong and who has no one left to ask. Because what my father had been shown, presented by Julian in the careful, reluctant manner of a man who hates to be the bearer of bad news, was a dossier. I know this word feels dramatic, but it is the accurate word. A dossier. Photographs, fabricated. Test results, purchased from a corrupt clinic whose records were apparently not entirely unimpeachable, but were entirely convincing to a father who was already looking for reasons to keep his distance. A paper trail suggesting erratic behavior, suspicious associations, a pattern of recklessness and instability that would, Julian had apparently argued with great sorrow, make the inheritance dangerously irresponsible in Frederick's hands. I'm not saying he's a bad person, Father. I'm saying he needs protecting from himself. The trust terms allow for an extension if there's sufficient cause. I'll handle the paperwork. He handled the paperwork. My 25th birthday came and went. The solicitors sent a letter, carefully worded, explaining that the terms of the trust had been reviewed and that the administrator, my father, had exercised his discretionary authority to extend the holding period, pending a reassessment of circumstances. There was a procedure to contest it. The procedure required, in practice, a lawyer who could stand against my father's choice of legal representation, which was one of the oldest and most expensive firms in the city. I did not have the money for that lawyer. The inheritance was still locked. I understand the elegant circularity of that particular trap even now. I was 26 years old and I was alone, and I was, by the quiet collective verdict of the people who were supposed to love me, not to be trusted. The Hargrove Gala was not the sort of event I usually attended. I had been largely withdrawn from social life for the better part of a year. The loneliness had thickened into something almost comfortable, the way cold eventually stops feeling like cold and starts feeling like just the air. But Julian had insisted. He had been particularly warm that week, particularly attentive, and I had been hungry enough for his approval to mistake his performance for genuine feeling. He wanted me to come. He said it would do me good. He said I had been hiding for too long. I wore the gray suit, the one that had been my mother's favorite on me. I did not know why I chose it that night. Perhaps some part of me, some deep cellular remnant of her love, was trying to armor me. The gala was at the Aldenmere Hotel, all columns and candlelight and the particular self-satisfaction of very old money in a very old room. I stood near the edge of things, as I always did, with a glass of something expensive that I was not actually drinking, watching the room perform itself. I was calculating how soon I could leave without Julian's disappointment showing up in my memory like a recurring invoice, when someone moved through the crowd in the specific way that some people move, not aggressively, not rudely, but with a quality of certainty that caused the crowd to simply reform around them, like water around a stone, without any apparent effort on either side. Xavier Cavendish Thorne. I knew the name. Everyone in that room knew the name. CEO of Cavendish Thorne Group, which had its architectural fingers in commercial development, finance, and 3 sectors of tech infrastructure that I did not fully understand, but that everyone spoke about with the reverence reserved for either scripture or weapons. 34 years old, unmarried, known for being, depending on who was speaking, either brilliant or ruthless or both, often simultaneously. He had a face that was difficult to read quickly. Angular, composed, the kind of face that gave very little away because it had been trained not to, or because it did not need to. He stopped. He looked at me. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I am aware of how it sounds, the fairy tale geometry of it, the too neat narrative shape. But the truth is simply that he looked at me, and I felt it like a barometric change, like pressure shifting in a room. Not because he was beautiful, though he was, not because he was powerful, though I was aware of it, but because his expression in the 2 or 3 seconds before it returned to its careful composure contained something that looked remarkably and alarmingly like recognition. He crossed the room. "You look like you're doing math," he said. "Either the exit calculations or the drink analysis." "The exit," I said, because I had long since given up performing social grace I did not feel. 20 minutes to the minimum acceptable departure window. He smiled. It was brief, and it changed his face entirely. 17 if you go through the east corridor, the staff entrance. Fewer handshakes. I laughed. I did not expect to laugh. The sound surprised me so much that I looked at the glass in my hand as if it might be responsible. We talked for the better part of 2 hours. I don't remember all of it, the specific sentences, the precise exchanges, but I remember the quality of it, the texture. He asked questions that were not small talk. He listened with his whole attention in a way that I associated, by then, with the very young or the very rare. He had opinions that were not apologetic. He disagreed with me twice about something related to urban development and the preservation of working-class neighborhoods being razed for luxury flats. And he disagreed without diminishing the disagreement, without the social lubricant of automatic concession. And somehow this, his willingness to be honestly contrary, made me trust him more rather than less. I told him about the textile company. Not all of it, not the inheritance, not the trust, but something about it. About my grandmother's founding of it, about the way she had built something with her own hands and what that meant to me as a kind of inheritance beyond the financial. His expression shifted in a way I couldn't entirely catalog. He was watching me as if I were something he was deciding whether to believe. "You have an extraordinary face," he said, and I stared at him because the sentence was so direct it arrived without warning. "I mean that literally. You don't perform anything. Everything you feel arrives on your face before you've decided to let it." "I've been told that's a liability," I said. "It's the opposite," he said. "It's the rarest thing in a room like this." Julian found me at the 2-hour mark. I felt his hand on my shoulder before I saw him, that familiar claiming pressure, and when I turned, his smile was warm and wide and wholly manufactured, which I did not see, but Xavier, it turned out, did. "This is my brother," I said, "Julian Voss." And I watched, in the space of a handshake, something happen in Xavier's face. Not dramatic, not announced, a subtle recalibration behind the eyes, the kind of adjustment that extremely intelligent people make when they have received a data point that does not match the existing model. He shook Julian's hand. He was perfectly courteous, but his gaze had moved slightly, had sharpened at its edges, and was now watching Julian the way a man watches something he does not yet have a name for but intends to name. Julian's smile, I noticed for the first time, because I was watching him through Xavier's eyes, which was like looking at a familiar room in a stranger's light, did not reach its destination. It was competent, the smile, it was produced, it arrived on his face from somewhere behind it, fully formed, and it sat there with the perfect stillness of a thing that has been very carefully placed. "I've heard so much about Frederick," Julian said, which was a sentence designed to sound intimate and actually conveyed nothing verifiable. "You'll be careful with him, won't you? He's quite fragile." That word, fragile. Julian had been using that word about me for years, and I had absorbed it so completely that I could no longer feel it land. But in Xavier's company, in the brief electric context of that evening, I heard it as if for the first time, and it felt like a hand reaching into my chest and rearranging something without permission. Xavier looked at Julian for a long, unhurried moment. "I'll be careful with him," he said pleasantly, "as careful as he wants me to be." And then he looked at me, and only at me, and the look contained something quiet and very solid, like a promise being made below the level of language. He called the next morning. I had left him my number, a small, terrifying act of hope that I almost immediately regretted in the elevator going down, and then unregretted by the time I reached the street, and then regretted again in the car in the oscillating way of people who are unused to being chosen and therefore cannot trust the moment of choosing. He asked if I would like to have dinner. Not a gala, not an event, not an occasion requiring performance. Dinner. The specificity of the invitation felt like consideration, and consideration felt, at that point in my life, like something I had read about in books. We had dinner. and then another dinner, and then a walk through the old quarter of the city on a Sunday morning when the streets were empty and the light was doing something extraordinary with the old limestone facades. And I told him about my mother's garden, about the lavender, and the particular way she could make anything grow, and he listened as if her life mattered to him because it mattered to me, which is a specific kind of attention that I had not known a person outside of memory could give. He never pushed. He never asked for more than I was ready to give. He was, in the language I can only find now that I have lived it, patient in the specific way of someone who is very certain. Not patient because he doubted the outcome, but patient because he respected the journey. There is a difference, and I felt it, and it terrified me in the best possible way. Julian began working very quickly. The first conversation was casual, offhand, designed to appear spontaneous. He stopped me in the hallway of the house, my father's house, where I still lived, which is its own particular statement about the economics of my situation, and he said, with his face arranged into its signature worried configuration, "I've been hearing things about Cavendish Thorne. Apparently, he collects people, Frederick, takes an interest, drops them when he's bored. Someone from the Hargrove circle told me he's done this before. Lonely, wealthy boys. I think he sees you as a project." He paused. He touched my arm. "I'm just worried. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't say something." I want to be honest, there was a moment, a brief, shameful, deeply human moment where the old machinery creaked into motion, the ancient, well-worn doubt, the familiar voice that said, "You know how people see you." Julian had maintained that machinery for 17 years, keeping it oiled, keeping it ready, and it did not require very much to start. But something was different this time. Something was different because I had spent 3 weeks in Xavier's company, and I had watched his face when he thought I wasn't watching, and I had seen something there that did not match the description Julian was offering. I had watched him listen to a street musician for 4 unscheduled minutes because the playing was extraordinary. I had watched him spend 45 minutes on a phone call, navigating a dispute between 2 members of his senior team, not by imposing his authority, but by asking questions until both people found their own resolution. I had watched him, on a cold evening outside a restaurant, give his coat to a man sleeping in a doorway, and then flag down a cab and give the driver an address and what appeared to be a very significant amount of money. And he had done all of this without making it a story, without performing his own generosity for an audience. I was not ready yet to say that I loved him, but I was ready to say that what Julian was describing was not the man I had spent 3 weeks watching. I said, "I appreciate you telling me," and I left the hallway. And I did not break up with Xavier. I think this is the moment Julian understood something had changed, because the next move was escalation. Julian arranged to meet Xavier. I was not invited. I found out afterward, much afterward, when the full picture had been assembled, that Julian had called Xavier's office directly, identifying himself as Frederick's brother and concerned family member, and requested a private meeting. I am told Xavier agreed with an immediate ease that should have told Julian something, but Julian misread it as his charm and misread it badly. They met for coffee. I do not have a transcript. What I have is Xavier's account, delivered to me later with the particular careful precision of a man who is angry on someone else's behalf and is working to modulate that anger into something useful. Julian brought photographs. I do not know where they came from. They were fabricated, this I know now, assembled from separate images with a competence that reflected significant investment of either money or time. They showed me in contexts designed to imply recreational drug use, the sort of pictures that are not conclusive but are deeply suggestive. And suggestions, Julian had learned from long practice, were usually enough. He also brought a summary, a written summary, that Julian had prepared a written summary of what he described as Frederick's history of emotional instability, his pattern of forming intense attachments and self-destructing them, and his long-standing issues that their family had been managing for years. "I'm not here to tell you who to see," Julian said, apparently. "I just think you deserve to know what you're walking into. Frederick is vulnerable, and I would hate for a man like you to be dragged into his difficulties." Xavier listened to all of it. He thanked Julian for coming. He was courteous. He walked Julian to the door of the coffee house. Then he went back to his office and put 3 of his investigators on it. He told me none of this at the time. He called me that evening and asked if I was free on Thursday, and I said yes, and he said he was looking forward to it, and his voice had the same quality it always had, warm and direct, and without any of the performance that had become my model for human interaction. There was no warning, no pulling away, no careful, apologetic distance appeared in his eyes. This is what undid me eventually. Not the exposure of Julian, though that was a kind of liberation. Not the inheritance, though that was a kind of justice. It was this. Xavier met the worst version of my story, the fabricated catastrophe of who Julian had spent years insisting I was, and he walked back to his office and began building a case for the truth. He did not come to me with doubts. He did not bring me the photographs and ask me to explain myself. He simply proceeded on the evidence of what he had witnessed with his own eyes and set about proving it. I was not a project. I was not a liability. I was not fragile in the way Julian meant the word. I was loved. I was, for the first time in my memory, actually loved without condition or performance or the lurking architecture of someone else's need. I did not know this yet, but the weeks that followed had a particular quality, a kind of held breath stillness, like the moment between lightning and thunder, when you know something is coming but cannot yet name its shape. Xavier's investigators were thorough. This is an understatement of the kind that only becomes clear in retrospect when you understand what thorough actually produced. They found the clinic, the laboratory that had produced the falsified drug test results, a place operating in the gray legal penumbra of a city that had, for many years, been better at looking away from inconvenient things than addressing them. Julian had used them twice. The records were sealed, but records have a way of becoming less sealed when a man with Xavier's particular combination of resources and resolve decides to look at them. They found the bank records. Julian had been careful, but he had been careful in the way of a person who never anticipated that anyone would look, which is a different kind of carefulness than the kind that survives scrutiny. There were payments, specific, traceable payments to the clinic, to a photographer whose other work was not the kind that gets displayed in galleries, to a legal consultant who had advised Aldrich Voss on the trust extension and whose connection to Julian turned out to be rather more than a professional acquaintance. They found the X's: Crispin, Matthias, Jonas, Elan. All of them had been approached by Julian after I broke off with them, not after long intervals, not by coincidence, but with a proximity that, when laid out in a timeline, described a pattern with the clarity of a geometric proof. 3 of them agreed to give signed statements. Matthias, in particular, had been carrying his version of this story for 4 years and gave his statement with the exhausted relief of a man setting down something very heavy. They found the correspondence, emails between Julian and their father's solicitors that I was not supposed to see, and that my father almost certainly did not know existed in their full context. The complete picture of Julian's engineering of my exclusion, assembled over the years in fragments that individually could be dismissed as brotherly concern and collectively described something with no innocent interpretation. Xavier brought all of it to me on a Thursday evening, 2 months after the gala. He did not soften it. He did not reach for the easy comfort of omission. He sat across from me at the table in his dining room, the dining room that had become, in those 2 months, one of the safest places I knew how to be. And he put the files in front of me and he said, "I need to show you something, and I need you to know that I am going to be right here, on this side of the table, the entire time you're looking at it." I read every page. There is a particular kind of grief that does not announce itself dramatically. It does not arrive in a flood. It arrives in the slow understanding of a pattern, in the specific, terrible clarity of seeing a life you thought you were living replaced, page by page, by the life that was actually happening to you. I had spent 20 years inside Julian's architecture, and I had thought it was home. Now I was standing outside it, looking at the blueprints, and I could see every load-bearing lie, every carefully positioned deception, every door he had built to lead me nowhere. The boyfriend who had taught me how to really listen to music? Gone. The one who had spent an entire afternoon teaching me the names of clouds? Gone. The one who used to leave small drawings in my coat pockets, found only later on cold days, like little paper gifts from a time already over. Gone. All of them taken from me, not by their own choosing, not by any deficiency of mine, but by a man who had looked at everything I loved and decided that he wanted it more. And my father who had not abandoned me out of simple indifference as I had always believed. My father who had been fed a lie so consistently and so expertly that his coldness was, in a terrible way, manufactured. He had been made to believe I was not his son to rely on. He had been turned against me from the inside. I understood, sitting there, what the core theme of my own life had been, stated in the language of old proverbs. When there is no enemy within, the enemies outside cannot hurt you. I had trusted an enemy within. I had given him a room inside my own heart, fed him, kept him warm, and all that time he had been mapping the exits, identifying the structural weaknesses, preparing for the day he would use what I had given him to take everything I had left. Xavier was watching me with his hands very still on the table. He had not moved. He had not said anything since he told me he would be there. He was simply present in the absolute and total way that some people manage, which is both rare and quietly extraordinary. "How long have you known?" I asked, finally. "Since the night at the gala," he said. "The way he put his hand on your shoulder, the way he used the word fragile. I didn't know the specifics, but I knew the pattern." "And you didn't tell me." "I didn't have proof yet, and I needed you to trust your own eyes before you saw mine." He paused. Was I wrong to wait? I thought about this for a long time. In another life, in a smaller moment, I might have been angry, but I was looking at a man who had spent 2 months quietly building the scaffolding of truth because he loved me too much to hand me unverified pain, and who had understood without being told that what I needed was not a rescue, but a reckoning, and that there was a difference. "No," I said, "you weren't wrong." Xavier requested the family dinner. This is the detail I return to again and again with something approaching awe at the particular audacity of it. He requested it. He told our father that he felt the family needed to be brought back together, that Frederick had been distant, that he was worried, that there had perhaps been some outside influence, and here he meant Xavier, that had driven a wedge between the family. He wanted to address it. He wanted to heal things. My father, who was lonely in the way of men who have built their isolation too well to see it as their own construction, agreed. He called me. His voice was the voice of a man performing warmth he was not sure he still owned, but the effort was there, and the effort was something. I brought Xavier. Julian did not expect this. I could tell from the specific quality of the stillness that moved across his face when Xavier and I walked through the dining room door together. Not surprise, exactly, because Julian was not a man who allowed himself surprise, but a rapid internal recalculation, a reconfiguring of the evening's tactical map. He recovered in under a second. His smile arrived, competent and warm, and precisely deployed. "Xavier," he said. "What a lovely surprise. Frederick didn't mention." "I asked him to keep it informal," Xavier said, pleasantly. He shook Julian's hand. He shook my father's hand. He sat down. He was the calmest person in the room, which, given that he was about to dismantle 2 decades of carefully constructed lies, struck me as either extraordinary self-possession or the particular serenity of a man who has very thoroughly prepared. Dinner proceeded. I ate almost nothing. I watched the table as if it were a stage, which it was. Julian performed warmly. Stories about the family, gentle reminiscences, the occasional concerned observation about my recent behavior slipped in with the practiced ease of a man who has been rehearsing this particular character for so long it no longer feels like acting. My father listened, nodded, cut his food with the mechanical precision of a man who processes emotion as administrative procedure. Xavier was charming. He asked my father about his work, about the house, about the city. He was interested in a way that looked genuine and was deployed with complete control, keeping the evening warm and social and moving, until the dessert course had been set and the formality had relaxed into something that felt almost like family, which is the specific emotional temperature Julian needed to believe he was winning. Then Xavier set the folder on the table. Not dramatically, not as an announcement. He simply placed it between the salt cellar and his water glass, and he said, "I hope you'll forgive me for bringing this to a dinner. I debated the timing, but I think Frederick has waited long enough." Julian's smile held. It held with the concentrated effort of a man who has built his entire life on holding expressions under pressure. "What is this?" "This is everything," Xavier said. He looked at my father. "And I would ask you, Aldrich, to read it before you say anything, particularly the third tab, which contains documents from the solicitors that I don't believe you knew existed, and the seventh, which contains the signed statements." Silence. My father opened the folder. I watched Julian watch our father read, and this was the truest thing I saw in that room, the most honest expression Julian's face had produced in my memory, stripped of its habitual performance by shock. He looked afraid. Not the performed fear of a man seeking sympathy, but the real involuntary fear of someone watching a structure collapse, watching the architecture of years and years of careful lying begin to fall, knowing that there is no intervention possible and no retreat available. My father read for a very long time. The only sound in the room was the clock above the mantelpiece, and, at one point, a small sound from my father's throat that was not quite a word and not quite anything else. When he looked up, he was looking at Julian, and Julian had no expression left. He had run through them all, and what remained was the face underneath the faces. Not cruel, not triumphant, not anything I had imagined. Just a man, with his hands flat on the table, looking at the consequences of himself. "Julian," my father said. Julian said nothing. "Is this—" my father began, and stopped. He looked at the papers again. He looked at me. And I saw it in his face, the specific, terrible thing I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. I saw him, believe me, for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever in the way that matters. My father looked at me, and I was legible to him, and what he read was the truth. "Is this true?" "All of it," Xavier said, quietly. "I can explain the sourcing of any document in that folder. My investigators are available if you require further verification. But Frederick has known about this for approximately 48 hours, and he asked me not to take it to lawyers first. He asked me to bring it here, to his family. I think you understand what was required of him." My father looked at me for a long time, and his face, which had been so practiced at a certain kind of blankness, was doing something I had not seen it do since my mother's funeral. It was working. Something was moving through it, behind the eyes, re-examining years of assumption, rereading years of his own choices through the corrected light. Julian stood. He said, "You don't understand the full context," and stopped, because there was nothing to complete it with. Context requires a story, and all his stories had been emptied of their supporting lies, and what remained was not a story, just a man, standing at a table. He left the room. I heard the front door. My father sat very still. He had aged, in those 20 minutes, in the specific way that people age when they discover the cost of a mistake they cannot take back. He looked at me across the table, across the folder, across the evidence, across 20 years of managed distance, and he said, "Frederick." Just my name, but the way he said it, as if it cost him something, as if he was saying it for the first time in the way names are supposed to be said, with the full weight of the person inside them, undid me in a way I had not expected. I did not cry then. I would cry later, alone in the dark of my own interior where no one could see it. What I did then was simply hold his gaze and nod once and feel the complicated grief of a love that had been withheld, not out of malice, but out of manufactured misunderstanding. A grief without a clean villain, which is somehow harder than the other kind. I packed for 3 days. This surprised me. I had expected it to take longer, to feel heavier, to require more ceremony. But when I stood in my childhood room and began to assess what was mine in the essential sense, what was Frederick, at 30 years old, standing at the doorway of the rest of his life, the answer was relatively simple. My mother's letters, tied in a string in the back of the wardrobe, which I had moved with me through 4 of the house's bedroom reassignments and never read in front of anyone. Her photograph, from the garden, the one where she is laughing at something outside the frame and her hands are in the soil, and she looks completely, entirely herself. My journals, a coat I loved, the small carved box my grandfather had given me with no explanation, I had eventually decided simply meant, "This is yours." Everything else was just furniture. Furniture I had been living inside for years, mistaking the room for life. My father stood in the hallway when I brought down the bags. He looked at the bags and then at me, with an expression that required me to look away briefly, because it was the expression of a man seeing clearly something he cannot retroactively fix, which is the particular anguish of accountability, and I was not yet in a place where I could hold it without being undone by it. "You don't have to leave," he said. "I know," I said, which was true. It was not a flight. It was not punishment. It was a choice. The first real choice I had made about my own life in as long as I could remember. The act of stepping through a door I had not known was there, not because someone had pushed me through it, but because I had, finally, seen it myself. "I'll be in touch," I told him. "There are things we need to talk about, when we're both ready. But right now I need to go somewhere that isn't this." I paused. "I need to go somewhere I'm not being managed." He flinched. It was brief, and then he nodded with the dignity of a man accepting a consequence he cannot dispute, and that nod was perhaps the most genuine thing he had given me in 20 years, and I held it on the drive away like a small, complicated treasure. Xavier was waiting outside. He did not say anything when I came down the steps with my bags. He opened the car door. He took the heaviest bag from my hand with the same matter-of-fact ease with which he did most things, not making it a gesture, just doing it because it was practical, and I was carrying it, and he had a hand free. This is, I have come to understand, one of the specific signatures of his love. It doesn't perform. It simply arrives and makes itself useful. We drove through the city as the last of the evening light was doing something extraordinary to the river. I watched it through the window. The light, the water, the city I had lived in my whole life, looking briefly, beautifully unfamiliar, the way things look when you are seeing them for the first time from the right side of something. "Are you all right?" he asked. I thought about this carefully. The honest answer was not simple. I was grieving my brother, who had never been my brother in the ways that matter. I was grieving the years, which could not be unlocked and handed back. I was carrying the complicated, unresolvable sorrow of my father's face in the hallway. I was also, and this was the thing I was least prepared for, the thing that kept arriving in the middle of the other feelings like a persistent, insistent countermelody, relieved. I was relieved in the deep marrow way of someone who had been holding their breath for 20 years and has finally been permitted to exhale. "I think so," I said. "I think I will be." He reached across and put his hand over mine, briefly, and then returned it to the wheel. That was all. It was enough. Epilogue. The lawyers took 4 months. Xavier's legal team was, in the gentle understatement of one of his senior partners, motivated. The fabricated drug tests were formally contested. The correspondence between Julian and the solicitors was entered into the record. Matthias's statement and the statements of the two others who had agreed to speak were submitted as supporting evidence of the pattern of manipulation that had formed the basis for the original trust extension. My father, to his lasting credit, and I say this carefully, making room for both the credit and everything preceding it, did not contest the proceedings. He submitted a voluntary statement acknowledging that his original decision to extend the trust had been based on information he now believed to be false. He bore the professional embarrassment of it and the personal embarrassment of it with a quietness that was, in its own way, a form of reckoning. On a Tuesday morning in September, with the particular gray autumn light coming through the windows of a room I had never been in before and that smelled of old paper and new beginning, I signed for the inheritance my mother had left me. I sat with that for a long time afterward. Not the money is real, and I am not pretending otherwise, and the freedom it represents is something I will spend years learning to inhabit properly. But the act of it, the moment of receiving what had always been mine, the formal, legal, irreversible recognition that I was exactly who my mother had always known I was, and that the story Julian had been telling about me, the fragile, unstable, untrustworthy Frederick, the burden, the liability, the one who needed to be managed, was a fiction, and the fiction was over. My mother, I think, would have had something to say about all of it. She would have sat in her garden with her hands in the soil, and she would have said something simultaneously practical and luminous, the way she always did. Something about how the enemy within is just a seed like any other, and that what matters is not the planting, but the growing conditions you allow. She would have looked at me with her specific, seeing eyes, and she would have known, I think, long before I knew, that I was going to be all right. I live in Xavier's estate now. The East Wing, which has been unofficially redesignated as mine. My books have colonized 4 shelves of a room that was previously some kind of formal sitting room. My grandmother's carved box is on the mantelpiece next to his, and the photograph of my mother in the garden is on the desk where I write. It is not the house I grew up in. It is something far more radical and far more essential. It is a place where I am seen, entirely, and where being seen does not require performance or management or the constant vigilant effort of being someone else's carefully assembled story about me. I have my mother's journals, which I brought with me in the cloth bag they have lived in for 17 years. I have not read them all yet. Some of them I am still working up to. But I read the first one on my 3rd night in Xavier's house, in the chair by the east window with the courtyard below and the nighttime city beyond, and I could hear, from the room below, the specific sound of Xavier reading, which is a sound I have already learned to know. The occasional quiet rearrangement of pages, the small creak of the reading chair he insists is not past its useful life. Ordinary sounds, domestic sounds, the sounds of a life that is actually happening, to me, in the present tense, without intermediary or management or the long, slow drip of someone else's carefully maintained lie. I am not fragile. I was never fragile. I was simply for a long time in the wrong house. I am home now. The end.